Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of HiFi Hour. My guest today needs no introduction. He is a true icon in the industry, Nelson Pass. Nelson, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you.
I am so honored to have you on the show because you have done so much for the industry over the last 50 years, as you mentioned, and I'm just really proud to have you on here and proud to be talking to you.
Well, like I said, pleasure to be here. It's a flattering introduction.
Well, I guess let's get right into it. So, what's the Nelson Pass origin story? Did you grow up around audio, and what got you into hi-fi in general?
I grew up around aircraft. I came from an aircraft family. But around age 15, 16, I started getting really interested in audio. And I went to school and at UC Davis, fell in with a crowd that was really serious about audio. That's, and it just took off from there. That was, well, my first full-time employment was ESS in 1972. So that would be just 50 years.
Okay. What did you do at ESS?
Um, I started out measuring, I was the only guy who could actually measure stuff, and I had access to the anechoic chamber at UC Davis, so I had the keys. So I was instantly popular with the guys who had started up ESS and were running it up as a competitor to Infinity. They kind of modeled themselves after Infinity, and the ESS stood for Electrostatic Sound Systems. A friend of mine who was a true electronics genius, his name is Pete Wehrbeck, he ran across these guys in a house in Sacramento making speakers, and they were, again, large electrostats. And he got a job with them designing amplifiers and preamps and such. And later on, I was introduced to them, and they went, "Oh, well, you look like a smart kid. Why don't you come work for us?" And in fact, I did. Now, about just after they hired me, they moved to a new location from the house to an actual industrial building, a small one. And they were manufacturing speakers. And about a month or so after I arrived, Oscar Heil met them, and that's when things started really moving fast. And in almost no time, we were manufacturing Heil transformer loudspeakers. I was in charge of the testing apparatus and the QA equipment and the procedures, and worked on development of crossovers and various and sundry. There were just two really technical boys in the house. I was one of them.
That's a good place to be, I suppose.
Great start.
So, what was the inspiration behind building some of the most iconic amplifiers that have really ever existed? Because you mentioned you came from a different background. What was it a kind of a learning curve to go from what you were doing and then into audio and making things sound just so amazing?
Well, it's like any track that you would see of an artist. I think of myself as an artist. Is that you start out by imitating other people's work and learning from it, and then slowly developing your own ideas. And and you just if you do that and not all that much else, you hopefully can make a lot of progress. And I really enjoyed doing that kind of work. I like to build stuff.
Mm-hmm. So who were some of your inspirations back then that got you started and got you excited about hi-fi?
Well, Pete Wehrbeck, the guy I mentioned at ESS, as I said, he was a certified genius.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
I'm sorry.
So I learned a lot from him. Um, I left ESS at the end of 1973, and I went to work as the service manager for the repair department of Sun Stereo, which was a California chain. And in doing that, I got to be inside of a lot of other pieces of equipment, stuff made by Sony and Pioneer and JVC, and numerous brands, Macintosh. Uh, so I, I was either fixing the stuff directly because I could, as manager, I got to pick what I did. So, so if it was really interesting, I chose to I'll do that. So I learned a lot about how stuff is built, what fails, I had access to all of the circuits. I got to play all the time with this sort of stuff. So that expanded my experience and my knowledge base and my sense of perspective about what's good and not. Um, not long after I left ESS, the marketing director at ESS, Renee Besnay, and I decided to form a company. I had an idea for a new type of Class A amplifier that ran more efficiently. Um, and we founded Threshold and launched the company over the course of that year that I was at Sun Stereo. And in 1975, we had our first product out, and that was the 800A big Class A amplifier.
Nice, nice. That's actually a pretty cool history. And it just grew from there, obviously, and it is what it is today, which is just a phenomenal situation. I mean, it's it's really cool because when you see a Pass Labs amplifier, you automatically, for the people that know about Pass Labs, they automatically associate that with quality, which, I mean, I guess that's everybody's goal in the business is to have that kind of resonance with the audio community. Now, can you tell me a little bit about Amp Camp and what was your desire to teach in this capacity? I know it was just a small run of classes, or I think you had a class of 20 people, but it's still a kit that's being offered today. I just saw one online, so for me, I would have loved to have attended the class, but what made you do that?
That's a continuation of a multi-year progression. Uh, when I was at ESS, I wrote my first article, which went into Audio Amateur. Um, I subsequently wrote another article for Audio Magazine, and in both cases, it was uh, especially the Audio Magazine one, it was build a Class A amplifier, and it was on the cover, and it was a big project, and you heard the schematics and everything that you needed, and so that kind of got me started, and that was back in the 70s, and I got involved with generally with DIY audio and writing project articles. Uh, about the time that the uh, Burning Amp Festival was created, which is about 17 years ago or so. Um, we also had a website called DIYaudio.com that was formed. And so a lot of these things started coalescing around the Bay Area and also people at DIY Audio. It just simply expanded the audience that I had for projects. And I like to do a lot of different things. I like to work on, I like to work on amplifiers and related items. It's what I do. And I have, at this late date, two companies that are, manufacturing product lines. That's First Watt and Pass Labs. And the amount of work that I actually do is more than is appropriate for uh, either of those two companies. In fact, it's a case where if you're successful in the product line and manufacturing, you end up in a little bit of a straitjacket, and the result is that if you want to do other things, you have to find some discreet way of accomplishing that without creating trouble in the marketplace. If I tossed out for sale everything that I worked on and played with, then there would just be a lot of confusion. And I've learned a long time ago that that sort of thing keeps you from making any money at the same at the same time. So Pass Labs has it's the kind of product that it is. We have dabbled in speakers, and we've had DACs and other kinds of projects before, and they all actually made money, but they were usually more trouble in the marketplace than they were worth. Uh, so we found it just easier to concentrate on amplifiers and preamps and stuff that's real close to that. Most of the DIY stuff were not things that I could play with commercially. So the easiest thing to do is to just stick it out there, and it not only it does some good in the community with people having access to uh, what I think of as quality design, but also it gives me the opportunity to try something out and get it out there and get some feedback about it and see how it plays and also I get to see what people are interested in, what what things they think about when they're dealing with audio or listening to it. That's all very valuable information, and it doesn't hurt my reputation at all. So, DIY is a major thing that I do. It occupies a good percentage of my time these days.
Well, the Amp Camp was wildly successful, and people still talk about it today. Now, do you feel someone? I'll put myself out there. Do you feel someone like me with a limited electrical or technical background can learn how to make amps, DACs, or other components in a DIY capacity and not blow himself up?
Well, you're probably not going to blow yourself up, but you do want to avoid being electrocuted. um, it's not that I have never seen an explosion, but it's quite rare. Well, but the answer is yes. First off, the kits and the documents that come with them and so on are designed for people who don't necessarily know very much. We're not assuming much uh, big technical expertise at all. It's really helpful if you can solder. It's really helpful if you're not colorblind so that you can read the color codes on resistors and such. It's really helpful if you can, especially if you can, operate a voltmeter, ohm meter, multimeter, which is this is an instrument that starts at about 10, $15. Uh, Soldering is the most exotic thing, something that you have to actually practice a bit before you get good. But well, I mean, these kits are good for that, and you can actually just go get circuit boards, that have got holes in them and stuff. And I have on numerous occasions sent people kits of junk parts to solder onto junk PC boards just to get the practice. But once you get it, it's just like doing a little dance with a piece of solder and a soldering iron.
I feel I'd say about 6, 7, 8 months ago. I can't even tell time anymore since the pandemic. I built a. It was already okay. I cheated. It was already a pre-made board from Parts Express, and a friend of mine who has a DIY audio channel on YouTube. Inspired me to try it for myself. See, at the end of the day, it was basically just connecting a few wires and soldering a couple things, and bada bing, bada boom, you're done. Took me about 3 hours to accomplish that. But aside from that, it ended up sounding pretty good. It was just a Class D amp, with 2 modules. And it sounds okay. But I took it to a friend of mine who, could builds power conditioners, and he knows how to solder pretty well. And he looked at my soldering job and he's like, "What is this?" He's like, "What have you done?" So he spent about 20 minutes showing me how to do it, showing me how how hot I needed to be, and and when he did it, he just made it look so easy and so effortless that I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like, but like you said, practice makes perfect, and maybe getting just a junk board with some junk parts, I can practice and get better at it, because that's the only thing I'm kind of worried about is when I see a kit and there's like 100 little tiny capacitors and resistors and stuff, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with that, But when I read about the amp camp, I guess you give very detailed instruction and stuff like that to make sure everybody has a successful experience with it all. So, hopefully someday, and that's maybe something I'm going to do someday, is maybe design an amp camp amp, but or not design one, but build one. That would be actually kind of fun for a project.
Well, I specialize in simplicity everywhere I go. I mean, I think that complicated circuits, they can perform some functions, but in this realm, which I regard as entertainment, simple is better. It's easier to access. It's easier to do. It tends to be very reliable. Tends to be quite stable, and if you do it right, it sounds very good. Um, the speaker, not speaker, but amp camp, um, was an interesting case. We so far there's been one amp camp per se. There was one at the recent Burning Amp Festival a couple years ago that was really a headphone amp plus preamp, and that was. But amp camp has become known almost as a brand. But the first one that we did, which was not too far away, I went down there and spent the day, and it was very successful. Everybody who attended left with an amplifier, except one guy who was an attorney who had to leave early. And so I actually carried, because I lived in his area, I carried his amplifier back to him in Sacramento. So the experience, though, taught me that such things as amp camp should be preceded by solder camp, because soldering was the big challenge. And I was showing a lot of people how to solder, and it was the major impediment. Everything else went pretty smoothly. So don't feel bad. And it doesn't take that much effort to do that. You just have to try it a few times.
I'm gonna have to practice, because I definitely want to build one of these amp camp amps one day. So I changing gears a little bit. I recently had the pleasure of listening to the First Watt Sit 3, and I was absolutely blown away by the sound quality. I actually just posted a video today talking about amplifiers, and I explained that an enormous amount of wattage isn't really necessary to produce room-filling sound. Can you explain a bit about the technology behind these low wattage amplifiers and why they sound so amazing, even at the 18 watts per channel that the Sit 3 has? It literally powered these huge custom-made floor standers that, granted they're very efficient, but still, I mean, for someone that doesn't know the technical side of it, is like, oh, you'll need 100, 200 watts to power this. They were singing at 19 watts, or 18 watts. Can you explain that a little bit more to me?
Well, I consider 18 watts to be a lot. Because I tend to listen to pretty efficient speakers. I've got some 95 dB full rangers from China, and I've got a pair of Zoos here that are apparently 100 dB. I haven't hooked them up yet; they just arrived. But in the case of the 95 dB sensitive speakers, they're playing pretty loud, and they're running at less than a watt. In fact, I have an oscilloscope hooked up to the system. I can look at the waveform on the scope and set the scale such that if the waveform is still inside the window, in other words, doesn't exceed the top or bottom barriers there, I call that the 1 watt window. If the trace is inside of that, it's less than a watt. Well, it's actually 2 watt peak. So, but the idea is the 1 watt amplifier can fill that screen. It's loud as hell when I play 1 watt. So there's a reason why I called that company First Watt. Um, People invariably think that they need more power than they perhaps do. Uh, of course, some people like to play really loud. Now, I have a system upstairs that has remained the same now for 12, 13 years. I mean, literally exactly the same, because I have a deal with my wife, which is I can have anything I want, but I can't change it out all the time, and I can't have any wires and stuff hanging around, and so that's the stock system. Well, that's got more conventional components. And when we put on some of the kind of rock and roll that she likes, or if it just happen to be Pink Floyd video or some other such, we will take it up, uh, and it can be pretty scary, and that's fun. But that's not the standard. The other thing, though, that's worth thinking about is that if you're going to build simple amplifiers, the easiest way to make them really good is to not require too much juice out of them. In other words, if you're talking 5, 10 watts, most people will be pretty happy with that unless they're running a disco. But a circuit like that, it's small enough to be run Class A without being crazy. Class A is still the smoothest, nicest way to operate audio components. And and they allow also for very simple circuits. So they don't measure tremendously well. I mean, the distortion numbers are not in competition with the latest things that are put out with, say, Class D or guys who are really shooting at very low distortion numbers. And the damping factor and all these other specs aren't extraordinary. In fact, in many cases, they're thought of as being kind of deficient and poor. But there's a quality to all this. One of those qualities is that from its simplicity, whatever it does do tends to be inoffensive. The distortion is a low order harmonic quality. Um, the amplifier, when it starts to overdrive or have problems, it does so rather gracefully instead of having a crack up and falling down. So also those are easy to build. Like I said before, they also tend to be quite reliable and they last a long time. For DIYers, it's an amazing thing for them because it can be done. The circuits that we see commercially are very complicated. It's almost like people are being paid by the part. I know designers who have been paid by the component and developed some sophisticated but very complicated circuits. But a lot of those never, you know, they don't have the kind of quality that I'm looking for. If you want a super accurate amplifier, you're free to go elsewhere. Um, to me, this is it's kind of like art. In fact, it is art. And I'm reminded, when I think of my own career, I'm reminded of Picasso, who said, I spent my first 4 years learning to paint as Raphael, and the rest of my life learning to paint as Picasso. So, and yeah, there'll be, and it's just like it's just like with art, when a guy looks at a abstract painting and says, "My kid can do better than that." Well, okay, maybe, but this is what I do. The people who are my customers like those kinds of qualities. The DIYers love them because they're accessible intellectually. They aren't huge efforts at complexity, and so that's the deal. And We do that at Past Labs as much as possible. We do it even more so at First Watt because the power levels are not nearly as high. And then DIYers, boy, there are no limits to what you might try to play with and see how it goes.
Yeah, my friend Mike, whom is where I heard the Sit Three. That's where I heard the Sit Three, and I asked him because, man, I was that impressed. I was like, wow, what an amplifier!
Well, we are out of those particular transistors. And what is one? There were three SIT amplifiers that I released at First Watt, and they came out of a relationship that I ended up having with a company in the southern part of the U.S. called SemiSouth, and they were pioneering silicon carbide as a semiconductor material. And somehow I just kind of came across them, and the transistors that they had, and they were extremely special. They were power JFETs, the junction JFETs, where y- prior to this there was really nothing on the marketplace. Actually, the Japanese uh, had pioneered something which they referred to as the VFET. The VFET and the SIT are the same thing. It's just that uh, that's what they called them in terms of their commercial usage. And you may remember those as the VFET amplifiers from the 70s and into the 80s from Sony and Yamaha specifically. The VFET or slash SIT stands for static induction transistor, and VFET stood for vertical transistor. Um, but these are power JFETs, and it means that they are made. They're not made from the MOSFET technology, which is metal oxide semiconductor. It's a whole other camp, which mostly dominates electronics today. But the FETs have a special quality, and in the case of the ones I played with initially from Semi South, they were pretty good emulation of a pentode tube. They had a real nice quality to it, but yet all the convenience of solid state. They didn't require super high voltages, but they did deliver lots of current, so they were in the operating range of what a speaker would naturally want to see. And they had that square law characteristic that you're familiar with in tubes. And there were some really nice tube-like qualities, and yet it had a lot of the benefits of solid state. So we went to market with that at First Watt. It was successful, and I began buying more of these kinds of parts from SemiSouth. This is a little startup, really. And I was talking to their head of development. He goes, maybe you'd be interested in these SITs. And I go, what's that? He explained to me that what they are is the same kind of thing I've been working with, but cooked in a process which made them qualitatively different. They were more like triodes than they were like pentodes. And the whole notion of going after the triode sound with a semiconductor was very appealing, but they had to be made custom. And I ended up spending, uh, well, let's see, 6 digits to get a run to get the semiconductors that I wanted, and but it was a nice pile, and they worked. It started out then with the SIT1, which was an amplifier that used a single SIT transistor, and it was the only gain device in the amplifier. It did have an optional buffer to give it a higher input impedance if you needed it, if your tube preamp wouldn't drive the normal impedance. But that was defeatable. You didn't have to use it. And after that, it was the only transistor in the piece, and there was no feedback and so on. It had the sound of just that SIT, the sound of one transistor clapping, and it sounded like a pretty nice tube amp. But it had its own qualities too. It didn't have to go through an output step down transformer. There were other things about it. Didn't age that ungraciously. So um, that was a big success. It also was easy to adjust the character of the sound because I had a knob on the front and a little meter. And it turns out that if you take a triode or an SIT, which is kind of an emulation of a triode, if you adjust its position in the load line, if you bias it for more current or less voltage, or you've got these parameters that you can play with, you can alter its character, and you can in the case of the SIT one, as you turn the knob down and that turned down the voltage, but raised the current at the same time. You went into a mode where you've got a fairly strong negative phase second harmonic. That's a it's a second harmonic, but the phase alignment on it is such that at all fundamental peaks of the waveform, the uh, the the second harmonic is on a negative peak. So, but if you then turn that up at some point up toward the top, you saw a positive phase second harmonic. So you got to not only adjust the amount of harmonic that might be in there, but you also got to flip its phase one way or another and see the difference on that. And in the middle, it was a spot where the second harmonic was nulled out altogether, and the only thing that was left was third harmonic. And these were very pure harmonics. The second was quite pure, and the third, when it was nulled in, was also there. It is on a spectrum analyzer. Not much else out there. So people were able to play with the sound. I made 10 of them. They were monoblock, so there were like 5 opportunities for people to borrow these things and listen to them. And I initially had set the meter so that the null occurred right in the middle of the green zone on the meter. But we didn't tell people what we were doing. We had them turn it up and down and let us know what you think. Well, it turned out that everybody wanted that thing turned down toward the left for second harmonic of negative phase. That was the general, not all, but general preference, which I found totally interesting. That in blind listening tests, people go, "I liked it here." So I made that the center of the meter, and we began shipping, and it was very successful. Subsequently, there was a stereo version that had 2 semiconductors on the output stage. I made it another transistor to bias up that SIT, and that raised the efficiency from the measly 10 watts we'd been getting to getting up around 20, 25 watts. And we were able to do it with 2 channels on a chassis. We started sending those out the door, and we sold those for years. Um, in addition to other products that weren't SITs, but it's the legend of the SITs continued to grow. Some years later, I got oh, I know what it was. You wonder why I do so much with DIY. It's because I get a lot of information back from people. I put stuff up on DIY audio, and I've got a little flock of guys who will sometimes go, "Oh, Mr. Pez, have you seen this?" And they would point to something, or give me a link to something, and it would be something really interesting, or maybe even fabulous. And in this case, it was fabulous. And my response was, "Well, thank you very much. I had not seen that." But the upshot is that I was steered to a site in Singapore, an outfit that had uh, Sony VFETs, which had been long discontinued, and the amplifiers had gone away in the 80s. And they had repair inventory. They had something like 3,000 pieces of these power transistors that were the VFETs. And not only that, but they were in 2 types of VFET. They were P channel and N channel, so you can make complementary circuits with them and all sorts of stuff. Well, I went in there and began playing with those, and I went, "Oh, holy crap! These are fabulous." Meanwhile, SemiSouth had gone bankrupt. And that big batch of SITs that I got lasted. Well, we still have like a few handfuls. It's not much, uh, and those are repair parts in case we need them. Um, we couldn't. We were looking at the end of the SIT amplifiers because of the Semi South was gone. But all of a sudden, there was like 3,000 pieces of these Sony VFETs, which are the same sort of part. And so I got a hold of those guys, and they were like cheap. And I bought most of their inventory. But what I, but so that I wouldn't be thought of as a complete pig, uh, I left. I left a good thousand of them there, and I told the DIYers, go get them. In fact, it was a case of while they last, don't kid yourself, and the price was right. So, but 2,000 power transistors for me is not actually enough to float production. So what I did with this, the first thing I did is telling, I have dozens of side stories here. The first thing I did was remember that I have some very good friends at Sony. And uh, but we didn't have enough of these to actually do production. So we wanted to do something great, but we couldn't, launch a product line based on them because it wouldn't last long enough. However, the people at Sony had been very friendly to us for a long time and done us numerous good deeds and favors, and we always tried to return the favor wherever possible. They were actually good customers of ours at the same time. So, and they sent checks, you know. So we were sitting around and I go, you know what we need to do? We should create the 40th anniversary commemorative Sony VFET amp with these parts because it was the 40th anniversary of their launch of the VFETs. And I went, oh, this is perfect. Now, so I called up the guy at Sony no, and said, this is what we want to do. And he goes, oh, well, I need it. It sounds great, but I need to, just kick that upstairs. Now, I was just trying to be polite to somebody who by the way, was also a customer. And so I got a call from the guy who later on actually became the head of Sony. Um, and he said, well, why would you do this? And I said, because we can. And he goes, oh, I love it. So we built a very small run of the 40th anniversary Sony VFET commemorative amps. And these were pretty large amps, and they had lots of VFETs inside. They were stunningly great. And we gave four of them to Sony, and that left two for me. Later on, they came back and got those two as well. But the great thing was that they just loved it to death because, as you know, Sony is an IP company these days. And more so than anything else, but they do celebrate their history of innovation and achievement. And this fit right in with that kind of attitude about who they were and where they came from. So they ended up taking these all over the world on tour. Uh, at the same time, they were actually on tour promoting their newer formats that the SACD and so on. So this just fit right in. So these things went on tour all over the world. And by the way, my name was there on the faceplate in the corner. So, it was excellent publicity for us as well. So that got me started. I ended up with six. Now, what we do have, the semi-south sits are gone. But it turned out that there was a company in Japan named Token, Tokin, that was manufacturing industrial versions of these parts. where the audio pieces, were, 50 to 100 watts. They could withstand, 50, 70 volts, 3, 4, maybe 5, 6, who knows, maybe 10 amps could be, but they weren't they weren't industrial. Token, however, was manufacturing what we call hockey pucks, that they were 700 watts. I've got a pair that are a kilowatt per transistor of dissipation. I've got they went up to over 1,000 volts. They went over 50 amps. These things were huge, and from the standpoint of what their performances in terms of high power and voltage and everything, they were a mile beyond anything I had been playing with before, and they were still triode characteristic. So now all of a sudden you got something that is huge, but is also, it would be like kind of like having a really big bank of triodes. You can imagine a room, or in the old days when they were making computers out of triodes, you can imagine that. And so they were still making them. But unfortunately, the Fukushima earthquake, you may remember, and the tidal wave that followed it wiped out the production capacity of token. Among the other industries got hit as well in that, but and their owner, as I understand it, NEC at that time, elected not to rebuild the fab line. And so it came down to, if you wanted them, it came down to hunting up whatever inventories had been salvaged or were sitting around, in the industry. I ran across two sources who were happy to sell parts. And then it turned out that they had actually quite good access to parts if you wanted to really buy a lot of them. And so I did. And so, yeah, we're currently in development on products that will use those for first watt. And so I expect that the SITs are going to not only continue, but we're going to start hitting higher power levels in terms of
Okay.
in terms of
Well, it seems. I don't want to call you bad luck, but it seems that you find, a special ingredient for these amplifiers, and then something happens, like bankruptcy, the tidal waves. It's like you finally found something you like, and you're like, man, this really works good, and you're having to re-innovate.
No, I get to re-innovate. I founded First Watt because I wanted to do stuff, but a lot of the stuff I might want to do distracts from the central business of PAS Labs. And so SITs are not at PAS Labs. They are more conventional stuff that we can get in quantities and act a little more conventionally in terms of how they work. So all the toys are over at First Watt. And it started out as my kitchen table company. But then it started being too successful. What I did is I incorporated it into PAS Labs so that they do the production and they're doing all the work. I'm down to the point now where I just create.
Well, I mean, for my buddy to say he'll never sell that amp is a big deal, because he's usually not emotionally attached to an amplifier, and just like I said, just by hearing it, you did a great job. Now, PAS Labs was founded in 1991, correct? And
Yeah.
can you tell me a little bit about the amplifier of the decade?
It was the Aleph Zero. Well, I had fooled around with Class A single-endeds before, but they had no place at threshold, which was building amplifiers that are, they were large and they ran hot, but they were high power stuff. And toward that end, we were trying to increase the efficiency of these amplifiers so that you can get up into higher power levels without having enormous and extremely expensive output stages and power supplies and heat sinks and so on. Not that there isn't a place for that, but I wanted to play with single-ended amplifiers, but like I said, it didn't have a place at at at, uh, at Past Labs. I'm sorry, at Threshold. This is kind of the story of my life, though. It's like, the company starts doing well and is successful, and it's time to move on into something which allows you to be creative, but it doesn't create trouble for the original operation, which is, by the way, still paying the salary typically. I mean, nice to have an income. So, uh, Past Labs was started out as that. I could do anything I wanted. I had a very small crew. I owned the building that it was in, and we just went at it. And the Aleph Zero was a MOSFET amplifier. In fact, it was the first commercial MOSFET amplifier that I did, and it was single-ended Class A. I had done a DIY single-ended Class A back in '77, which actually was kind of popular, but had had not had not pursued that commercially. Oh, I know. I have somebody is cleaning here today, and there's a vacuum cleaner. I have to watch out for what kind of sounds I'm in my environment. You never know what could have accidentally gotten turned on. Anyways, so uh, this was my chance to do what I wanted with Past Labs, and so we built that, and it was a little crew. We even built our own machine shop, so we were machining our own metal. That was the best part. Is for the first 6 months of that company, Mike Burley and I, he'd come with me from Threshold. We built CNC mills. We bought old Bridgeport mills and hooked stepper motors up to them with belt drives and programmed cheap window not Windows DOS PCs to send pulses to the stepper motors and run them, and then programs to so that you could tell it I want to cut from here to there, or even better, I want to carve a letter in some metal. So this is what we did, and the Aleph Zero was the product. And so I sent a pair of them. They were monoblocks to Dick Ulsher, who is still with us, and he just loved them to death. But I kind of knew that they were going to be to his taste, because I kind of knew his taste. He referred to himself as the old tube man, and single-ended tubes were right in there for him. And also he liked the nice full-range efficient speakers with maybe a little woofer down below them. So I kind of figured that this would hit him where he lived, and so that's how it got called Amplifier of the Decade.
Now, I really like the Past Labs X150.8. I was looking at it online, and if I were in the market, that's probably the direction I would go in. It looks clean, it looks sleek. It's an entry level AB amp in your series, but I took a poll online on my YouTube, and I asked a lot of people what type of amplifier they prefer. I gave them the option of tubes. I gave them the option of Class A, Class AB, and Class D. And around 56% chose Class AB. Now, why do you think the majority of people prefer AB amplification over Class A or D? And why do you think that?
Well, AB is a nice compromise. The efficiency of, if you're listening at normal levels, the efficiency of a Class AB amplifier can be, in terms of what it just draws out of the wall just sitting there, is tremendously less than that of a Class A. But if you're down at those really low levels, and it's in a Class A region, and you're not doing so badly by yourself in terms of the quality, you can make very fine measuring and sounding amplifiers using AB. It's really kind of the standard of where you might be if you're a reasonable person. Class D is this whole other thing. I've always said it's a miracle it works at all, much less as well as it clearly is. And they are achieving great, enormously clean specifications for the quality of Class D. It's not what I do. I've actually done Class D. It never ended up exciting me or having me want to take it any further. I love Class A or heavily biased Class AB. That's kind of where I live. Um, it makes for simple, reliable circuits. The sound of Class A, I'm sorry, of Class D doesn't actually do that much for me. Um, but I would say in general, it's more and more the wave of the future. Again, though, it's whatever you like to listen to.
Now, I do have a couple questions that a couple of people wanted me to ask you. First one was linear and switching power supplies. Do you have a preference, or do you feel one is superior to the other, depending on how it's applied?
Well, I do both. I have a tendency to use switchers on DIY projects because it's easy. And I don't know if you're responsible for people wiring up AC line potential circuits. At DIY audio, you do not see linear power supplies for sale because they're concerned about that particular aspect of it. So I tend to do a fair amount of development these days with switching supplies because it's inexpensive, it does the job, and if it's adequately spec'd in terms of its usually its current capacity, then you're not going to run into any kinds of real issues. At the same time, though, just as with Class D amplifiers, they're switching at very high frequencies, and it shows up. I mean, in other words, it's even though they take pains to take the noise down and shield it and filter it, that you still end up with some of that stuff out at the other end of the cord, that where the amplifier section is. However, you can additionally filter beyond that, and routinely all the projects will have some additional passive filtering on the power supply lines to take that out. Well, that works really well. If you're not dealing in really high power, uh, you can rationally do a DIY amplifier with a switching supply, and I do it routinely. At Past Labs, we like the old classic monster transformer and big bank of capacitors. That's our audience, and you can build amplifiers either way, and you can make them quite good. The large linear power supplies. I don't know why they call it linear because there's a lot of nonlinearity going into creating one. They're really saying classic transformer, rectifier bridge, and capacitor bank. Um, they require even more filtering, relatively speaking, than the Class D. Class D is pretty easy to filter because most of that is at very high frequencies, and the filters don't have to be real huge and so on. If you are trying to get totally clean power with no ripple in it on a linear supply, you're either going actively regulating or you're building huge filters. Well, that's okay. But the essence of it is that it's almost like there's two camps here. There's the people who uh, like the performance of a switching supply. I mean, it's first off, it's very simple. From the consumer's inside, it's terribly complicated. But from the outside, it's just a little box. You plug it into the wall, and on the cord on the other end powers your typically DIY product.
Right. And the last question before we get into the final question is op amps. A lot of people are taking products like these little Chinese manufactured. This is a little tube preamp, but they are making these to where people can swap out the op amps for better, you know, for better sound quality. Is that something that is realistic and should be, you know, I don't know. I guess the question is, a lot of people think it's snake oil. A lot of people think it's the real deal.
Well, of course, all this started with tube rolling. People began swapping out different tubes in their amplifiers and listening to the difference and going, I like this. Now, even if it wasn't resulting in much in the way of improvements, it was fun. I mean, it's a hell of a lot cheaper than buying a new amp or new speakers or, I mean, fill in the blank. So it's it either delivers better sound and people are happy, in which case I say it's entertainment, or the process itself is entertainment. But in every case, this is what we're doing here. I listen to vinyl most of the time. Upstairs, I have only vinyl. Uh, in the system, my wife won't allow me to change anything. Uh, I like the sound. Of course, I grew up with that sound. I'm imprinted with that sort of sound in the same way that my dog is imprinted with my voice, and that's the sound that I like. In the case, so, but in the case of op amp rolling, first off, I expect that the differences are going to be a lot more subtle because op amps are objectively less distortion, and so on. So that the kinds of things we're looking at become a lot more subtle. I actually like to build my own op amps if I'm going to do that because I can build an op amp with one, two, three, four, five transistors. I can actually build one with less, but this one would be a pretty good one, you know. And I could use JFETs or MOSFETs. I mean, they're bipolars. You can plug that stuff in. They're conceptually not very problematic and not very complicated. Stuff that's been made monolithically tends to be a lot more complicated and a lot more, a lot more in there, as it were, a lot more pieces talking to the signal or conveying it or doing something. That complexity to me is something that I try to avoid it. So you go back and there's old classic op amps that were a lot simpler from the old days when they couldn't print nearly as many transistors on a substrate and get it to you. I think it's valid to try different op amps, particularly I think go out and try some of the really old ones and they have a very bad reputation op amps. But yet, in point of fact, in some cases, it's kind of interesting what they've managed to get done, and they measure higher in distortion, for example. But all this depends on what kind of distortion you're looking at. People are very tolerant of those low order harmonics. They hate those jaggedy higher order harmonics that they can hear a lot more easily. I look at a product like that, op amp or power amp, on a distortion analyzer, and I look at the distortion waveform because I can look at it and go, I don't like the looks of that. I don't even care what the number is. I don't like the look of it. But if it's a real nice negative phase second harmonic of any substance, I'll go, well, there's going to be a little more depth to the sound of that amplifier, but it's going to be very smooth. It's going to have a little warmth to it. People are going to like it. Now, I mentioned the negative phase, positive phase thing about the second harmonic earlier on. It's interesting. There is, in general, there's a kind of a general opinion amongst the people who listen to the positive versus the negative phase second in terms of what they perceive. And I find it totally fascinating, which is the negative phase. People tend to interpret the sound as being deeper, a little farther away, but having a depth. It's almost like that camera trick where you can adjust the lenses on a camera and something gets real close or gets farther away. Well, it's kind of like that. And as you go to a positive phase second harmonic, by contrast, suddenly it's a little more in your face. It's a little more intimate, And some people like that. In fact, it might even vary with the material or the particular recording. But a lot of people really enjoy that negative phase second harmonic. So if you look at the waveforms coming out of all these old op amps and stuff that you're rolling, or the tubes for that matter, you can see this on a distortion analyzer. You don't even necessarily need the numbers. You can just see it. Um, but it's all entertainment again. I would if I would play with that. And there are people making discrete op amps for you to plug in to your into the products that you've got now.
But final question: any plans for future companies, projects, products that you'd like to share, even if it's just like a little teaser that you can't really?
Well, I have to be very discreet. I do have another SIT amplifier being put together here for first watt using these larger parts. And so you're going to see that either end of the year or sometime here early next year, I hope. But I've got working prototype that seems to be meeting our approval. And I'm not the only guy who listens to this stuff. I send it back to them, and then they tear it up and sometimes reject it outright. But and at past labs, we have a tendency to just have a lot of continuity. So that you look at what we've done, the Alephs lasted, I don't know, I think probably we must have sold Alephs, the original Alephs, for about 10 years or so, even after we developed the X product. And the first editions of X lasted well over 10 years before we made changes. And then we did the point 0.5 series of those products, same product name, but we made some improvements in that. And another 7, 8 years goes by. I mean, it's been 30 years now, so you get a sense, and we've gone through. Well, we're on our fourth thing, which are the point 0.8s, and so we're real slow to do modification on product. And a bunch of little things kind of gather, and then when there's enough of them, we upgrade the product. And then we continue to build the old product for 2, 3 years because distribution worldwide wants the old product too, and often has there's different distribution for it. So we go, fine, if you want to buy it, we're happy to build it. That's not a problem. But so the point 0.8s, I think they're getting on to be about 5 years or so. So it's going to be time to start thinking about that. But at the moment, I've been concentrating on the first watt SIT. Now, I'm not the only guy designing at Past Labs either. Wayne Colburn, who has been more or less by my side for, I don't know, 40 years or so. I mean, it was a long time. Ultimately, as his career grew, he began doing all the preamp work. So if you see a preamp from Past Labs, that's got his name on the inside. And I nod approvingly, and we discuss things, but it is his product. So there are actually, two guys doing fundamental design, and then there's a couple of people at the factory who tear those things down and make sure that it's all correct and meets safety requirements, or they catch the things like, did you know that these resistors are running at 125 degrees centigrade? No, I did not. I thought they'd be running a little cooler than that. No, they're not. So there is a collaborative aspect to that whole thing. The gentleman who was president of Past Labs, well, I was initially the president. And then when Joe Samet left Krell, he had been, some of these people go back all the way to ESS. I've got, Joe Samet was a stockholder at ESS. He's deceased, but his wife was an accountant at ESS. Then she managed the money at Threshold for all those years, and then they both went off to Krell for a couple of years and made Krell do real well, in my opinion. And but they came back, and I got them back after some time, and then they began running. Then I made Joe president of the company because this is not a job that people actually want. This is a job that people are forced to do. And so he put in his time. He had brought with him a guy from, well, he had hired at Krell, but who came from Ireland as a digital engineer to do digital work, but discovered that this guy was terrific also at doing industrial design. And his name is Desmond Harrington. So he came over early in the years of Past Labs. And that was when our faceplate started looking really great. And Krell's maybe not so much. Uh, After Joe got tired of being president, we made Desmond the president. He's been president for, I don't know, going on 10 years. Well, he wants to retire and go back to Ireland, and he's built a house and so on. And we have a retirement program where you still get paid and you still answer the phone if we call you. But Joe and Barbara, Joe's dead, but Barbara, goes all the way back to 72 at ESS, became the controller of the finances and accounting and everything. Her daughter, Anastasia, worked for Hewlett Packard in the accounting department, got tired of Hewlett Packard, came to Past Labs. Oh, she was made president this year so that Desmond could let go of it. Anyways, these people go all the way back to 72. My wife, I met her she was on the production line at ESS, and then because she was stuck there late at night, and I was working nights, I showed her how to use the test equipment. She became, in the end, she was the head of quality control by the time it became a big ass company. I managed to acquire her at Past Lab at Threshold, and we hooked up subsequent to that. And we've been married. Well, actually, we've been married 40 years. I met her 50 years ago. Well, there's the story.
Oh man, I'm sure there's more. I'm sure there's more stories that we'll have to get to another time. But Nelson, I want to thank you so much
it's a pleasure
for your time. It was really fun to hear everything about the history and how it all came about. And your love for quality and entertainment is really inspiring because this is fun for you. This is like kind of.
It's what I do.
Yeah, you're the Picasso, and this is your canvas, and you've done an amazing job. Like I said, you are a true icon in this industry, and I'm lucky to have had you on the show. I learned a lot about amplifiers.
That's great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope everybody else enjoyed it, and. If you haven't checked out Past Labs, please do so, as well as First Watt. I will be looking out for that new SIT product here soon, and I'm sure there's going to be.
Let me say, everything I ever wrote is at First Watt posted, so you can go through all the articles that I've ever put out.
I got some reading to do then. Thank you, Nels.
Well, thank you so much.
I appreciate it.